Hello everyone, in today's video we'll be looking at an absolute cracker of an attacking game played by none other than MVL, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. The game was played on chess.com and we have MVL playing with the white pieces against a German grandmaster by the name of Valko Bindrich. Let's get into the game. MVL starts with c4 and we quickly transpose into a semi-Slav. So we have the pawn triangle here from black, and we have an early e3 from white, which means we could potentially get into a Moran variation. We have bishop e7, so black is avoiding mainline Morans, which would start with knight Bd7, queen c2, castles, bishop d2, knight d7, and now have a look at what MVL goes for. h4, he is not messing about here, not quite play with bishop to d3, he is launching his kingside pawns up the board. It's going to be a spicy game. b6, and rook to g1 from MVL. Absolutely no second guessing what his intentions are. He's looking to absolutely throw his kingside pawns up the board and demolish that black kingside. So what counterplay can black muster up, because he's already committed his king to the king side, so that's where his king's going to be for the rest of the game. It's going to be in the firing line. What can black muster up here? Bishop b7 and g4, launching his pawns up the board, not wasting time with castle and queen side first. He's just pushing as quickly as he possibly can. And black plays c5, opening up the scope for his bishop. And MVL continues his march up the board on the king side, striking out the black knight on f6. Black moves his knight that was under attack and jumps into e4. And we see an exchange of pawns in the center, a recapture, and bishop to d3. And now we can see this knight here in the center of the board from black is being attacked by three pieces here. We've got the bishop, the knight, and the queen. And we're only being guarded twice here. So we've got the bishop and the pawn. So what can black do here? Now notice that the white battery here with the queen and the bishop is also x-raying h7 as well. So black can't simply, for example, take a piece, such as taking on d2, because have a look at this. We wouldn't just simply recapture that knight. No, we would first take on h7 with check. After black moves his king, we recapture with our king, and have a look at this. If black tries to trap our bishop, we don't simply chop on g6. No, we play h5 here, looking to break up the structure completely. And if black tries to take that bishop, we take on g6 with check. We give a check with our rook. We come in with our rook. Now notice that we have our queen on c2, targeting the pawn on g6 as well. So there is a mate in one threat at the moment. Black would be forced to play queen to e8, guarding that location, but then we'd simply double up, and this is a completely crushing attack here. There is no rescuing it for black. So now that we have just seen that black cannot move his knight to capture any of the pieces because of the pressure on h7, black plays the other logical move, which is to try to guard his knight. He plays f5. White captures en passant, opening up the g-file. Now the rook is placed very nicely against the black king. We have a recapture of the pawn, and now the knight is sufficiently protected in the middle of the board there. We have knight to g5, adding further pressure to that knight. And here we have an interesting move from black. He pushes forward with c4. Have a look at this. Very interesting. It forces the exchange, bishop for knight. Black retakes with the pawn. And in this position here, you might think to yourself, hang on a second, that pawn is being attacked 1, 2, 3 times by white, and only guarded twice by black. Isn't that just a free central pawn for white? Can he just simply take that pawn? Well, in the actual game, MVL played knight to e2, but let's have a look at some of these crazy possibilities of what could have been if he simply takes that pawn in the center of the board. If white tries to take that pawn, have a look at this crazy variation here. We have an exchange of pieces. white would retake. Now black would not give his bishop up for this knight. Instead he plays this centralizing aggressive move, queen to d5. Now we have pressure on the knight. And now let's say for example, white drops his knight back to c3, hitting the black queen. Have a look at how quickly black musters up an attack here. He's got a few different options here. He can potentially come into f3 with his queen, pressuring down the f-file, but I quite like this variation. Have a look at this. The queen slides across to h5, and let's say white tries to block things up in the center by pushing forward with e4, trying to limit the scope of the bishop. Have a look at how quickly this attack unfolds. The rook takes on f2, sacrificing the rook, and the point is that if white retakes, there is a very quick checkmate that follows. We slide the rook across, and we take on h4 with the bishop, and it's a quick checkmate. So some absolutely incredible possibilities here in terms of how quickly black could generate some very strong counterplay here. We can see from the engine analysis though, knight to e6 was absolutely crushing, forking the queen and the rook, which would have been a pretty trivial win for MVL. This was played in a bullet game though, so instead he went with knight to e2, but I'm actually glad that this move was played because we ended up with a really fascinating attacking game. Let's see how things play out. Queen to d7, so guarding e6 and stepping out of that fork. Knight to f4, and now we have a nice clustering of the white army surrounding the black king, so it looks like there's going to be a lot of action in this area. Black moves his rook to c8, as he knows the white king is most likely going to end up castling queenside, so that rook being placed there is generally a good idea. MVL jumps into e6 with his knight. Multi-purpose move. We are striking the rook, but also notice that when this knight moved, it vacated the file for the rook. So now, not only is the knight attacking the rook on f8, we're also threatening to take on g7 as well, which would be absolutely crushing. So black must defend that. He steps up with his rook to f7. MVL drops back, striking the rook, which goes back to f8. And now instead of repeating moves, MVL plays this really fascinating move here, which I never would have played in a million years, but have a look at this. He plays pawn to d5, just completely sacrificing his central pawn. It's hard to imagine how mere mortals like us would even consider playing such a move, but the point is this. Black retakes that pawn with the bishop, and now he castles queenside, and the fact that this pawn is no longer there means that his rook on d1 is now super active and lined up against the enemy queen, and also that central pawn on d4 not being there anymore means that his bishop can slide across to c3 or the queen and start pressuring the king side as well. So MVL's position is actually much better now, and he's a lot more active with his pieces by the fact that his own pawn is no longer there. So just completely throwing away that pawn for nothing in exchange, except for open lines for his pieces. Black steps his queen off the d-file as it was being x-rayed by the rook, and we have bishop to c3 now, so lots of nasty looking x-rays here by the white pieces against g7. Is something dangerous going to happen there soon? The bishop drops back to f7, more defensive posture, and MVL launches his pawns up the board. Black actually has that square well covered, but it's quite clear that MVL isn't worried about losing that pawn, as that would simply open up the h-file and be quite dangerous. Black asks the question of the g5 knight, and have a look at this. He simply takes on e4, and you might be scratching your head there, like, hang on a second, black has this square covered, like, isn't that just a free piece? But the important point is that this knight is playing a very important role here. If that knight ever moves, for example, to take the knight on e4, look at what we've just opened up, right? Black would end up walking himself into a windmill. I think we just have to see this. Let's actually play this forward just so people can see how ridiculously strong that attack is. So if black actually tries to take that free piece in the middle of the board, we come in with our rook to g7, giving check. The king steps out, And you might recognize this as being your classic windmill tactical configuration with the bishop here delivering discovered checks. But white doesn't simply scoop up everything here immediately. Have a look at this. We first give up our queen for the knight because that knight could have ended the windmill formation by taking that bishop on c3. And after black retakes, now we start hoovering up in our classic windmill formation. And have a look at this. It is absolutely devastating. So do keep an eye out in your own games for opportunities for you to play the windmill tactic against your opponents. It's very fun to do. Okay, let's go back, as that's not what was played in the game. White took that central pawn, and black realized that he cannot move his knight. It is playing a important defensive duty at the moment, protecting g7 and stopping that windmill tactic from happening. Instead, black moves his rook to e8. MVL brings his knight back to g3, eyeing f5. And if that knight manages to get into f5, all hell is going to break loose for black. A knight on f5 here will be hitting the bishop, it'll be hitting g7 with support from the rook. It'll be hitting h6 as well, as the g7 pawn is pinned. So can black do anything to stop a knight from landing on f5? It looks like it's going to be absolutely crushing. So black ignores it and just pushes on with his own agenda. b5, he's looking to just launch his own counterattack against the white king here. He's going into pure race mode. He thinks that he can't defend his situation on the king side. He probably sees what's coming and just thinks that maybe he can run his king out of danger. He thinks that the best possible chance for him is not to sit back and try to defend what ultimately he won't be able to defend. Instead, he tries to go on the counter-offensive. He pushes his own agenda forward. b5, very brave here. MVL jumps into f5. How can you not? Look at this. e7 is under threat, which would be forking the king, the queen, the rook. An absolute family fork being threatened here. Not only that, we are striking g7 with both pieces. We are threatening to take on h6 here with check, as that pawn is pinned to the king. There are so many threats at the moment. What can black do? And he simply steps his king onto f8. Okay, interesting defensive idea. Protecting his bishop, getting out of that dangerous g-file. Okay, can this hold? What is white's follow-up here? Now have a look at this. The actual game continuation from here was rook takes d8, but you might ask yourself, well, hang on a second, that pawn on g7 there, we're attacking it twice with our knight and our rook. It's only being guarded once by the king. Can we just scoop up that pawn? Have a look at this. If white tried to take that pawn with his knight, it pretty much invites black all the way back into the game. Take a look at this. He first exchanges rooks. Notice that our rook on g1 is needed to protect our knight, so we need to recapture with the queen. And have a look at this. Black pushes forward with b4, hitting our bishop. And now, geez, it's really unclear of what's happening here. The bishop's under attack. We've got nothing really to do other than exchange it for the knight on f6. And after black retakes, he's about to crash through against our king now. He's threatening to pick up our loose knight there. The tides have turned completely. This is not what MVL would have wanted. But I found it so instructive to see how quickly in this game, at various situations, black can just very quickly generate very dangerous counterplay. Okay, let's have a look at how the game continued. So MVL did not take on g7. We first saw an exchange of rooks, and after a recapture, and now he takes on g7. So what's his idea here? Black pushes forward with b4, just as in the other variation that we saw. MVL steps forward to d4 with his bishop. And b3, have a look at this. He is striking the queen, looking to open up files against the king. We have an exchange of pawns, and now queen to f3. Black is getting really desperate here. And now we have knight e6 check, forking the king and the rook. And notice that if black were to take that knight, it would simply get replaced by the other one, and that same fork would still be there with the other knight. So black simply moves his king. We have an exchange, so now white has scooped up a free exchange. And now from black we have an intermediate capture. He takes on b3, striking the white queen, but unfortunately for black, The final move now is the nail in the coffin. MVL steps up to c6 with check. He's forking the king and the queen. That's the key point here. This forces an exchange of queens. The queen is guarded by the knight. And have a look at this. The point is, if black were to take that queen, which he's forced to do, he would recapture with the knight. And notice that this knight jumped into e6, forked the king and the rook, picked up the rook, and now jumped on out of there. So he's basically just picked up an entire rook for free. So actually, after white gave that check on c6, black resigned. So what an incredible attacking game here from both players. Opposite sides castling, pawn storms on opposite sides of the board, and absolutely insane variations here as well. So I hope that everyone enjoyed that game as much as I did.